My life changed permanently in September of 1965 on a bright and sunny morning. My automobile, an old 1951 Ford that my father had given me for my 16th birthday the year before, was in the repair. The owner owed my father a lot of money for all the tires he had used as a circle track racer, so Dad negotiated a deal with him to fix up my car. The engine was a flathead 8 that would have been fine for any 16-year-old at the time, but Dad had other plans. Joe had created a racer engine out of a 1953 Ford truck engine. He went through it, doing all he could to extract additional power from it, including balancing and blueprinting. The racing committee said no when he took it to the track. He was stranded with this monster because it was too much for the track. As a result, he required another engine to overhaul and make less lethal. My father thought it would be a good idea to put a racetrack band engine in my automobile. I was without a car on a very important weekend. I'd set up a date with an older woman, the 18-year-old cousin of another girl I lusted after. We were headed to the drive-in, and we weren't going to waste any time. She'd previously exposed me serious skin and kissed me as if she were about to eat me. I begged Dad to let me drive my brother's 1959 Impala. He'd given it to Dad for safety, but when he arrived in France, he told us we may keep it. When he arrived in Nancy, he purchased a 1956 Mercedes Gullwing and moved down at the airbase. He eventually relocated to Paris. The automobile was crushed when a truck tipped over while driving around the large traffic circle near the embassy. Another reason why I refused to drive in Paris. Dad asked Mom if she was okay with it, and she said she was all right, as long as I left her off early Saturday morning with my sister across town in Sodaville. Saturday morning, I got up extra early and called Kathy to ask if she wanted to make a day of it and go to the coast, then to the drive-in. We agreed on a time because she sounded excited. I sat in the car for what seemed like hours, waiting for Mom to come out and settle in. As we went over the bridge into town, she commented on how beautiful the river was and advised me to take the road along the river's east bank. Something strange happened just as we were ready to turn onto the river road. Allow me to travel back in time a little. Dad and Mom loaded me into the old Chevy, a 1947 sedan, I remember, and we drove down the hill to town when I was around 3 years old. The neighbor's horse had walked through the gate at the bottom of the hill, and when Dad hit it, it flew through the front window in between Mom and Dad and landed headfirst on me. I have no real recollection of it, but I know I was unharmed. However, following that, I began to perform strange things that irritated Dad greatly. For example, when we were about halfway to town in the 51 Ford, I whirled around in my seat and began shrieking that the barn was on fire. We were so far away from the home that I couldn't have seen flames or even a glow, but I refused to give up. Dad yelled at me to stop talking and then slapped me. That didn't work, so he turned around and drove back home, convinced that a yelling brat had spoiled dinner. As we approached the driveway, we noticed a little flame flickering beneath the barn. Dad had been drying maize in an old tin bushel tub placed on top of another with a bed of coals. They were built atop bricks, but a lump of coal had fallen through a rusty hole in the tub and onto the straw. When we got home, the fire was just getting started, and Dad quickly put it out with a hose. He didn't say anything to me for a long time after that. He simply stood there staring at me. A few more incidents like that, such as running away from the little one-room school at the bottom of the hill in the middle of a lesson, only to discover my mother had fallen through the back door window while cleaning the gutters. She had seriously injured her arm, so I stemmed the flow and summoned help from the neighbors. That was likewise rewarded with silence, which contrasted Mom's exaggerated praise. Return to 1965. Anyway, let's go back to 1965. As we approached River Road, I had the uneasy feeling that something was awry. I came to a complete halt and fastened my seatbelt. I'd never worn one before. My old Ford didn't have them, and I insisted that Mom put hers on as well. She refused, claiming that it would damage her hernia and that she would be okay. I gave in and we had a wonderful drive along the Santim River, with Mom remarking on the scenery and me fantasizing about getting laid. As we exited the river and approached Highway 20, she advised we take the Sodaville Road detour. This was a short gravel road that was overgrown with bushes at the time, so you were driving through dense plants on each side, some of which leaned into the road. A raised railroad crossing, one of those where you had to drive up and over the track, was at the end of the road. The crossing sign had fallen due to age and the X was practically straight up and down. The sun was shining over my shoulder and the shrubs were well lit. The undergrowth had not been trimmed back for the year, and the tracks were just high enough that you had to slow down to get over them. This has changed now that the track has been lowered and the majority of the brush around the tracks has been removed. I couldn't see down the track to the left as I slowed down to look. I was driving forward when I heard a thud. NDE. I was flying through a spinning blue tube at breakneck speed. As I rose up into the open, I was on the outskirts of a vast region filled with, for want of a better phrase, souls as far as the eye could see. Some close, some forever far away. Yet there was a deep sense of perfection, stillness, and amazement. It was like being with everyone who'd ever lived or will ever live at the same time. I could have various feelings about different persons. I was overcome with excitement and love. The fact that there's no there, no sight, sound, or anything we can relate to is the best I can do to put it all into words that might make sense. As I approached the edge, I was greeted and welcomed with such great sense of joy, good, and well-being that I began to forget everything that had come before. I use the term time because it's what we're used to, yet there's no time there. I was given a clear choice between staying and returning, and I was encouraged to do so. The only way to describe what happened next was to imagine yourself braided with other souls, like strands of flowing water, being made whole and returning to this world from a point above the car. I could see the entire planet, then the horizon, and finally the area below me. There was a train with our car stranded in front of it, a crowd of panicked people, an ambulance pulling up, and fire trucks. Cars and trucks stopped on both sides of the road. I stood there for a long time watching this. Then a strand continued down into the automobile, and I was back inside my body. When I opened my eyes, they were dazzling white. My right arm was free, so I lifted it and brought it to my eyes, only to see that I was covered in cloth. When I pulled it off, I heard shouts and a few screams. The woman who was holding my mother's head fainted as I looked over. There was a rush of panic and exhilaration, and one of the guys approached me. I focused my attention on what was going on and noticed there was a train in my lap. My legs were slightly bent at the knee. The coupler was atop my lap, and the knuckle was resting to my right. The seatbelt had dragged me down with the car's frame and held me there until the couple came through the door, or rather, over the door. I didn't feel any pain, just a lot of pressure. But my right hand had a piece of window glass between the thumb and fingers, and I was seeing it bleed. Blood had been accumulating in my arm, and now that everything was working properly, the blood was pouring out. They covered my hand with the glass shard still in it. I'm guessing to stop the bleeding. The medic inquired if I could understand what he was saying. "Hell yes! Get this effing train off me!" I exclaimed. When I asked about Mom, they claimed she had made at least 7 journeys from the front seat to the back seat, like a rag doll, while they helped her out of the car and into the ambulance. The tires were tethered to the ties, and none of them had lost air, so it was a rocky ride. 510 feet down a railroad track on the side. To put that in context, consider 2 football fields minus 30 yards. One of the ambulance drivers had draped a sheet over me. He discovered no pulse, no respiration. He claimed to have used a hand mirror to check for breathing, and no bleeding in my hand. They were all convinced I was gone for good, so pulling the sheet off after such a long time came as quite a surprise. It's difficult to say how long I was gone, but the train hit us, traveled 510 feet, car stopped, An ambulance was summoned, and they'd been there long enough to get my mom practically out of the car when I returned. The hospital is 4 miles away, so it may have taken 5 or 6 minutes to get there. It's difficult to impose a time limit on the event because there is none. I was there what seems like a lifetime ago. There was a lot to learn. I tell people it's like living in a thick bush and never seeing anyone save his friends and family, never seeing a plane in the sky. Suddenly, a helicopter drops a net on you and transports you at the speed of light to Times Square at midnight, leaves you there for a few minutes, then brings you back, drops you in the midst of your town, and all your friends come up to you and ask, "How was it?" Getting away. I was instructed to remain cool and still. They couldn't see my left side, but there was blood and a small cut above my left brow that was flowing profusely. The car had been refueled the day before, so there was gas all over the place. They couldn't figure out how to get the train to move away from me. Because of the gas, they couldn't use cutting torches. They let the air out of the tires in hopes of lowering the vehicle. No such luck. I finally directed them to go retrieve the tie-down chains from the Rose logging truck because the trailer was up and empty, binding the car to the tracks and causing the train to back off. "What about your legs?" one guy inquired. "What the hell? Are you frightened of hurting me?" Christ. So they unloaded the chains from the truck, wrapped them around the ties, attached them to the frame, and the engineer began backing up the train. As the knuckles slipped over my lap, there was a horrible clang of steel hitting steel. My legs bent even further backwards, and I could feel everything dragging from my waist down. The pain was excruciating, and I saw white spots. The door suddenly sprung up and away from me. My legs sprang up a little, and my arm was free. I was ripped from the upper arm to below my elbow, but that was the extent of the damage I could see. They helped me onto a stretcher and inspected me, prodding and poking to see if I had any internal injuries. I spent a lot of time in the ambulance, floating in and out and observing from above as we traveled through town. I recall thinking how lovely the day was. Before he discovered I was still alive, a state cop came to our tire store and asked Dad if he knew a John. His father stated that he was his son and that he lived in Los Angeles. The cop informed him that the automobile had crashed near Highway 20 and that the boy inside had died. This was some time after they had gotten me out. He left for the hospital, where he had been promised the woman would be. When he arrived, he hurried into the emergency room, right past me. He dashed over to Mom, who was in a coma and receiving treatment for her injuries, which included broken ribs, a concussion, broken kneecaps, and several scratches and bruises. As Dad stood there in disbelief, I spoke up and inquired about Mom's condition. He was almost knocked over. He ran up and grasped my hand as I apologized for destroying the car and injuring Mom. He couldn't say much since he was so bewildered and delighted, other than, "To heck with the automobile," and "Ruth will be fine." The radio is dead. KGAL had been telling everyone all day that I had died in a railway crash. This was bothersome because that was the station I was listening to in the hospital bed. I requested the nurse contact my friends Larry, Kathy, and Carol, as well as my sister, to let them know I was still alive. A full day of being dead on the radio was a strange experience. My father even tried calling and stating I was still alive, but they mistook him for a prank caller and hung up on him. Finally, about 11 p.m. that night, after a few shots, Dad drove out to the studio and stopped them from playing requests in my honor. He informed them that I was in the hospital and that they may contact me in the morning. They did, but who turns on the radio on a Sunday morning? I began ringing for a nurse after hearing myself on the radio all day and being told that I might be unable to walk for several weeks. I desperately needed to use the restroom, but they refused to assist me. I rolled out of bed and landed on the floor. I dragged myself up and fell again and again, but I made it to the restroom. I didn't want to lie down once I finished, so I held myself up on the bar that runs along the wall, pulled myself along the wall to the entrance, out the door, and down the hall. I kept pulling my legs under me and walking by lifting my hips and allowing my legs to fall ahead of me. This worked well enough for me to make it all the way around the hall from my room and back. I was able to balance without the bar by this point, roughly an hour later, as long as I didn't allow my knees to bend forward. It must have appeared amusing. I got up about 6 more times during the night and walked, so when the doctor came in the next morning, I jumped out of bed and scolded him for telling me I couldn't walk. I was still on a lot of painkillers, but I was in a much better mood. Mom was across the hall, and I walked over to check on her frequently. Larry arrived with the books I had requested, and I reclined in my bed like a dying man, breathing ragged, short breaths and moaning. He was barely there for a minute before he began to leave. "Hey," I said as I sat up. "Whither are you going?" He nearly slugged me. On Monday morning, some Southern Pacific lawyers arrived and persuaded Dad to settle for $250,000 rather than sue. That was a lot of money back then, and Dad needed it for the tire store, so I signed the paperwork and that was the end of it. I later learned that the brakeman had a heart attack when he saw the car on the tracks. The train was doing 45 miles per hour. They claimed 30 miles per hour and did not blow a whistle before the crossing. They were hauling lumber from a mill and were completely full. That's why it took so long to come to a halt. On crutches, I returned to school on Tuesday. When people saw me, they would either scream, faint, or simply stare. My first class with Paul was biology. I sat in my normal place, and when the roll call was called, he skipped over my name. I waited for a few names before saying, "Hey, you forgot about me." I swear half the class, including Paul, fell out of their chairs. The wreck was all we spoke about for the rest of the day. Who saw it? Why they thought I was dead? Why I wasn't dead, and what it was like to be dead. After a few days, I threw away my crutches and realized I wasn't the same person who had left that Saturday morning. I began to see, hear, smell, and feel everything around me without thinking about it too much or understanding it was abnormal. At the same time, I could hear what people were saying across the room. It felt like I was looking through a 360-degree lens on my way back to the car. It was a little overwhelming at first, and it took some time to get used to. When I did, I figured everyone else was doing the same thing. I'm still astounded by how little people see and hear what's going on around them. This ability has served me well throughout the years in the Army, and it manifests itself virtually every day. My hands are also unusual. They become so hot that they almost sparkle. Even if I move my hands a foot away from someone, they will feel that heat. I've dealt with patients who suffer joint pain and other health conditions. They claim it's beneficial, but I've no idea what it is or why it is present. The following two. 8th of August, 1994. After 3 years of a medical study evaluating a medicine that lowered acid production in the stomach, numerous endoscopies and other endoscopies, and my doctor's assurance that the surgery, a Nissen fundoplication, would be simple and quick, I headed to the VA hospital in Portland, Oregon. Hello once more. I was back where I'd been many years before, surrounded by sunshine and warmth and the familiarity of folks who had once been near to me. I was once again enveloped in a sense of perfection. I was abruptly drawn back into the room, where I could see people panicking and sense their fear. I stood there watching as they worked on me and used the paddles to get me going. Then I woke up in the recovery room. I was still trying to piece together what had occurred when one of the nurses and a doctor stepped in and said, "Well, things went bad 3 hours into a 2-hour surgery." My thoracic muscles spasmed, and the CO2 that they had used to inflate me was expelled up into my lungs. My heart stopped beating, my lungs popped cornered, whatever that means, and I died. They brought me back, re-inflated me, finished the process, patched up the small laparoscopic holes, and everything was okay. They sat me up, handed me a small pillow to place against my stomach, and told me to breathe slowly and carefully for a few hours. They then left and another nurse entered to connect me to a couple of monitors. My girlfriend came in and sat with me, holding my hand, and I fell asleep. I awoke feeling out of breath, as if I had just finished a sprint. Odd, I thought, as I tried to inhale, but could only take short, shallow breaths. I informed the nurse, whom I had to send Maria to fetch, that I was certain something was wrong. She reassured me that my feelings were normal and that I should not be concerned. Out of body. I started to panic about an hour later. This was about 6 hours after they finished the procedure. I couldn't take more than a small gulp of air in. I felt like I was drowning. I tried to get someone to notice what was going on, but they just couldn't answer. I sat there, and it was one of those moments I'll never forget. I yelled, stood up, and watched the monitor transition from a pulse to a solid tone. I'd hit rock bottom. I was free of my now limp and dead body. I floated up and marveled as they dashed inside the room. They dragged me on a trolley and hurried with me down the corridor to an elevator, and out to the hall and into a room where they dumped me on my front and inserted enormous needles into my back and up into my lung cavity, draining the fluid. I can still see those people working together to extract the gray, thick fluid. Then they turned me in and started prodding. The one doctor, who had dark hair and an accent, leaped up on me, took a knife to the skin right beneath my left nipple, and sliced it along the rib. I jolted awake. The cry could be heard 2 levels away, according to witnesses. They placed a rib spreader before inserting a tube. They then did the procedure twice on my left side, beneath my arm. They blew it the first time and had to try again. If you take your finger right now and press it in the area where you're most sensitive, around halfway between your armpits and where your elbow contacts your side, you will locate the spot where they sliced me open and inserted another hose. Overall, there are 3 tubes. This was a very horrible experience that I would not recommend, ever. I lay on my back for weeks with a glopta machine hooked to me like a hungry octopus. I got weaker and lost more weight until I was around 165 pounds. I was being devoured from within. When I deflated, the laparoscopic tools inside me nicked a bowl and punctured the pleura, introducing an E. coli infection into my lung cavity, where he and his offspring established themselves and were very happy, warm, and well-fed. 3:30 p.m. Finally, a new face appeared at the door one day and presented me to the head of thoracic surgery from San Francisco General. He felt my chest and advised me that I needed a CAT MRI to assess how bad things were in there. My pleasant young female doctor, who had arrived a few days before, instructed the nurse to obtain a blood sample and to insert another IV line. 4 p.m. She gave up after a brave effort and around 10 tries and was called away. My doctor returned and was not polite to the poor nurse. She took my left arm in her hands and inserted the needle directly into the vein. Art at its finest. She then inserted an IV line into the one small vessel left in my right hand. She moved my gurney down the hall, down the elevator, and down another hall to the MRI room, where the employees had already put on their jackets and were heading out the door. She told them to let me in, and they did so reluctantly. 5 p.m. The doctor entered the room next to the MRI lab and sat on the gurney while she held my hand in hers. "If we don't do this procedure right now, you're going to die." I smiled and informed them that it was too late. They told me I had a 30% chance of survival if they operated within the next couple of hours and brought me a phone. "Call your family and friends and say your goodbyes." Those were possibly the best and worst calls I've ever made. I'm crying as I write this, remembering the pure love I felt for those who'd been there with me and were now hearing me say goodbye. I felt the most incredible sense of peace as they put me under. I opened my eyes to see the doctor's bright smile. He put my hand on the back and congratulated me on my survival. "You must be here for another reason. You must have a job to do." They had stretched my ribs on both sides, shifted my lungs around in my chest, and rinsed out whatever they could. They kept coming in and telling me how incredible it was that I was still alive, so I presume it was a difficult procedure. I was 162 pounds when I left the hospital a few weeks later. When I first stepped into the gym, I weighed 219 pounds. Not a diet plan I would recommend.